Good day. Today is Tuesday, 30th September 2025, and over the last 24 hours, somewhat out of the blue, though in reality the telltale signs that it was coming were all out there. But anyway, suddenly we've had the announcement in the United States by President Trump of a 20-point peace plan to end the conflict in Gaza. And President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu have announced Israel's apparent support for that plan. I say apparent because, as we will see, in reality, it's far from clear to me that Prime Minister Netanyahu is indeed signed up to this plan, or that the Israeli government is going to be either. But anyway, let's talk about what this plan involves and whether it will work. And from what I can understand, the essence of the plan is this. Firstly, Hamas has to release the remaining hostages. Supposedly there's 48 of them, but it's been suggested that there might be, some of these might actually be dead now, but it has to release them or their remains within, I believe, 72 hours. Secondly, the Israelis will release around 250 prisoners and another 1,000 individuals that they arrested over the course of the fighting in Gaza, detained over the course of the fighting in Gaza. Now, this, from Hamas's point of view, probably is important because though it is now a historic issue for many people, I doubt most people remember this, but the original justification that Hamas gave for the incursion into Israel that it carried out on the 7th of October 2023 was that it was seeking to take hostages in order to force the Israeli government to release various Palestinians who had been taken into detention. Now, let me repeat again a point I've made many times. It is not legally acceptable to take hostages in order to leverage the release of prisoners, even if those prisoners have been illegally detained. I want to say that, but let me move on from that and say that obtaining the release of at least some prisoners would probably be essential for Hamas if it were indeed to release hostages. And I understand that the prisoners that we're talking about, the 250 prisoners, are people who were being held by Israel before the attack took place on the 7th of October 2023. Anyway, once all that is done, Hamas is supposed to disarm. There is supposed to be a technocratic government established in Gaza, made up apparently of Palestinian officials. It is to be supervised by a board, which will be headed by none other than President Trump himself. There was a disastrous proposal that was circulating over the last couple of days that the person who would be heading this board would be the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. Thankfully, the idea of putting that disastrous individual in charge of this board has been dropped. I'm assuming that some of the Arab and Muslim countries pushed back strongly against it, knowing how sympathetic to Israel former Prime Minister Blair has consistently been. I'm not going to discuss that further, except to say that it does seem that Blair will nonetheless be a participant in this board, supervising the work of this Palestinian technocratic administration of Gaza. Israel is supposed to withdraw its forces from Gaza. though not immediately and in a staged form. The plan then appears to be to eventually integrate Gaza and to bring it under the control of the Palestinian Authority, which is based, of course, on the West Bank and which continues to receive international recognition, including from the Arab states, as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Of course, many people, both in Gaza and on the West Bank, in fact, in the Palestinian territories and in the Palestinian diaspora and the refugee camps that are scattered across the Middle East, no longer recognize the Palestinian Authority as their representative. But anyway, it preserves international recognition. Then, importantly, as part of all of these arrangements, a peacekeeping force is to be introduced into Gaza, and it's been suggested that most of this force, which would operate under a UN mandate, would come from various Muslim states, and Indonesia, which is, I believe I'm right in saying, along with Pakistan, the biggest Muslim state, is offering to contribute apparently a significant part of this force. And once all of this is established, then further steps will be taken towards achieving the two-state solution envisaged ever since the original UN partition plan of 1947 and reiterated in the various resolutions that the UN Security Council issued after the Six-Day War of 1967 and repeated and endlessly discussed since then, moves towards the establishment of a Palestinian state and a two-state solution. Now, can I say straight away that though Donald Trump is taking credit for this plan and is presenting it as his plan, it's clear to me that that is not actually the case at all. Now, the plan was actually first promoted, or first, shall we say, highlighted, by a joint statement made by the Arab states about 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, in advance of the discussions in the United Nations at the General Assembly. We've seen various European states move towards recognizing the state of Palestine. I've already discussed the extreme cynicism of some of the European leaders who have been taking this step. But alongside that, the various Arab states made a similar proposal, or rather, essentially, the identical proposal. They were very critical of Hamas. I have discussed in program after program on this channel, on the Duran, Alex, Cristoforo and I have also discussed in program after program how the Arab states, with all but one exception, that exception being to some extent Qatar, have never made any secret of their intense dislike of Hamas. Perhaps the new Syrian government of President al-Shara, which has long-standing historic connections with Hamas, can also be said to be a friend of Hamas today. But overall, the Arab states do not like Hamas and never have done. And some Arab states, like Egypt, for example, which has banned the Muslim Brotherhood with which Hamas is affiliated, well, they don't merely dislike Hamas, they are probably ideological and political adversaries and even enemies of Hamas. Anyway, the statement of the Arab states basically criticized Hamas, blamed Hamas or criticized Hamas for the original attack on Israel on the 7th of October 2023 and proposed a resolution of the conflict in Gaza, essentially on exactly the lines that we are seeing. A return of a restoration of the authority of the Palestinian Authority to Gaza, perhaps through various transitional arrangements, the technocratic government and all of that, the introduction of a peacekeeping force drawn from the Arab states and the Muslim world, and all of those things into Gaza in order to stabilize the situation there, and the disarming of Hamas, and essentially steps taken to try to achieve its sidelining or marginalization. So what has happened is that President Trump has taken this Arab proposal and is now repackaging it and is presenting it as his own peace plan. Now, I'm perhaps being a little unfair here. It is likely that there has been a lot of discussion behind the scenes. Steve Witkoff, after all, is in regular contact with the Arab states. It seems that President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, has also been involved in some way. There's probably been a lot of discussion and negotiation and backdoor maneuvering, and this has shaped the plan, and it is likely that the Americans have had some input into it. But I have no doubt that overall, in its in its broadest outlines, what we are looking at is an Arab proposal, a proposal basically pushed by the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and its allies in the Gulf. This is their idea of how the conflict in Gaza should be ended, and the other Arab states, including Egypt, support it. So this is the proposal that we have. Now, I have a number of points to make. Firstly, this proposal, if Israel really has accepted it, is a proposal that was almost certainly there on the table directly after the events of 7th October 2023. In program after program, in discussion after discussion, both on this channel, on other networks, on the Duran itself, I have repeatedly pointed out that there was always a diplomatic option that could have been taken by the Israeli government and by the Biden administration in the aftermath of the events of 7th October 2023. I have repeatedly said that this could have been done through the United Nations, through the Security Council. Hamas had no friends on the Security Council and basically no friends in the Arab world. That was even truer in October 2023 than it is today, because of course in October 2023 the government of Syria was still the government of Bashar al-Assad, and he didn't like Hamas, and he certainly didn't like the Muslim Brotherhood, against which he was in permanent conflict. So something very like this plan almost certainly could have crystallized probably fairly quickly after the events of 7th October 2023. If the Israeli government, and by the way the Biden administration and the European states, had sought a solution similar to the one that is being presented as President Trump's plan. Now, well, I think within a few weeks they would have got it, and moreover, that would have happened without 2 years of war, without 2 years of incredible violence, without the humanitarian catastrophe that has played out in Gaza, of which everybody is aware, without the multiple court decisions we have also seen, without the prosecutions by the International Criminal Court, the case that has been brought against Israel in the International Court of Justice, the recent decision of the United Nations Authority that I have also discussed. All of those things could have been avoided, and we could have had a plan, a proposal very like this put in place. And it is important to say that this proposal actually perhaps does represent a change in the dynamic of the situation in the Middle East and in the Palestinian territories, if, which is a huge if, it is ever brought into effect. And the change in the dynamic would be if Muslim, Arab peacekeepers were ever to return to Gaza. Now, I say return because there have been no Arab troops in any part of the Palestinian territories, the West Bank, Gaza, any part of the territory of the former British Mandate of Palestine since 1967, since the Six-Day War. Jordan, up to the Six-Day War, occupied the West Bank. Egypt occupied Gaza. They were not very friendly, it must be said, to the Palestinians. But anyway, they were Arab armies. And of course, as a result of the Six-Day War, they were driven out. And now, according to this plan, they would return. And they would return in a different form from the one that existed before 1967, because now, of course, they would return not as occupying forces, which is what the Jordanian and Egyptian forces essentially were before 1967, but rather as peacekeeping forces, recognizing the authority of the Palestinian Authority, which means, in effect, the Palestinian state, which is going to get soon international recognition and a seat in the UN General Assembly. So, for the first time since the 1967 war, Israel will find itself facing an entity inefficient, riddled with corruption, deeply unpopular in many respects, but an entity, the Palestinian Authority, that supposedly represents the Palestinians and which is recognized internationally as a government of a Palestinian state, and it will receive de facto support through the presence of Arab and Islamic military forces from the Arab and Muslim states, which will be stationed for the first time on the territory, part of the former territory of the former British Mandate of Palestine. Now that makes it all but inconceivable, in my opinion, that Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government will in the end accept and work with this plan. Larry Johnson on Sonar 21 says that this plan is effectively dead on arrival because the Prime Minister Netanyahu is currently going through the motions of pretending that he supports the plan. In practice and in reality, he's going to do everything he possibly can to try to sabotage it. And the reason for that is putting aside all of Prime Minister Netanyahu's various domestic internal problems, legal problems, which get an awful lot of attention. Prime Minister Netanyahu's entire political career, since as far back as he has been active in politics, has been to oppose the setting up of a Palestinian state on any part of the territory of the former British Mandate of Palestine. And he's going to not only oppose it, but he's going to oppose it still further if it has any kind of backing from provided by the presence of a military force, however conditional, however compromised that military force is, provided by the Arab states and the Muslim states on any part of the former territory of the British Mandate of Palestine, especially if that force, that peacekeeping force, has a mandate from the United Nations. Prime Minister Netanyahu and other hardliners within the Israeli cabinet will almost certainly be saying to themselves that if they concede this, if they allow this to happen, then sooner or later, in some form or other, probably not very soon, perhaps in 5 years or 10 years' time, demands will expand for the scope of this peacekeeping force to be expanded and to be introduced into the West Bank as well, in order to block moves by Israel, by the Israeli authorities, to expand settlement activity there and to engage in annexations of territory there. So, however compromised and corrupt the Palestinian Authority is, however supine the various Arab leaders are, and by the way, I think that is sometimes overstated. After all, they did come up with this plan. Well, however compromised, corrupt, incompetent these people are, this concedes on principle ideas that I cannot imagine Prime Minister Netanyahu or the current government of Israel accepting. And already I've seen that Prime Minister Netanyahu is now pushing back on some aspects of this plan. He says that, contrary to earlier media reports, he still has in no way accepted the establishment of a Palestinian state on any Palestinian territory. He also denies claims that he has agreed to what is actually required by this plan, as I understand it, which is the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza, complete withdrawal. However protracted that process is, eventual withdrawal, complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. And of course, what Prime Minister Netanyahu says in using relatively careful diplomatic language, the various hardliners within the Israeli cabinet, people like Smotrich and Ben Gvir, who are openly demanding outright annexation of Gaza. Anyway, they will, of course, oppose this plan, and they will oppose it fiercely. And, well, Prime Minister Netanyahu probably knows that his government wouldn't survive if these personalities pulled out of his government. But anyway, I don't believe myself that Prime Minister Netanyahu would accept this plan anyway, in any form, because as far as I can see, it is fundamentally contrary to his own political beliefs. Now, given that that is so, almost certainly he's going to look for ways, and the Israelis are going to look for ways, to walk back and to sabotage this plan. This has been the consistent practice. It has been to appear to accept plans and then to try and find ways to undermine them. And they will undoubtedly point to steps taken by Hamas, because if I can say so straight away, what is proposed for Hamas is probably unenforceable, and unworkable. Hamas is supposed to disarm. I cannot imagine, given what has happened, given the violence of the last years, given the nature of Hamas, that it would ever agree to disarm and expose itself, as they would say, to potential Israeli retaliation when they would have no means to respond or defend themselves. So I cannot imagine that they would do that. They would perhaps go through the motions of appearing to disarm, but we all know that Gaza is a complex place, that there are workshops and industrial facilities and bunkers and tunnels and all of those kind of things. Some weapons would undoubtedly be hidden away. Other places to manufacture them would be preserved. The Israelis would no doubt complain that Hamas is not carrying out its part of the bargain. So I can't imagine that this plan is going to succeed, is going to work. Having said this, I'm not going to be completely negative about this proposal. It is a proposal which does perhaps represent a step towards an eventual solution. It's one which the international community, as it is called, I know many people are very cynical about that word, those words. I once remember hearing a critic of the expression refer to the term international community as the friends and allies of the United States. Anyway, the world community, the world opinion probably would want to get behind a plan like this as, at any rate, a stepping stone towards a solution. But I am not going to get my hopes raised. I don't expect this plan to work. I don't expect any plan ultimately to work whilst the politics of Israel remain as they are. It would require a different prime minister and a different government with a different kind of agenda to move forward with a plan like this. Though, were that to happen, I suspect that disarming Hamas, getting the support of the Arab states to at least try to achieve that to a certain degree, would become possible. And then the balance of events, the dynamic of events will change. But as I said, I am not holding my breath. Like Larry Johnson, I don't expect this to work. I don't think it will work. But anyway, it's at least an attempt to wrestle with these problems. And that, as far as I'm concerned, is a step forward. Anyway, there'll be more to say about this, no doubt, over the next couple of days and weeks. That is all I'm going to say about it today. We'll see how it plays out. But as I said, I'm going to make a prediction that this plan in its existing form is not going to be taken forward anywhere very far. Now, let's turn to other matters. And when I talk about other matters, I'm going to talk about the perennial conflict, which is the one in Ukraine. And here I have to say that the situation in Europe is becoming, well, I think hysterical is perhaps an understatement. The language and rhetoric that is pouring out of European governments is becoming, frankly, extraordinary and extremely alarming. Now, the Foreign Minister of Poland, Radek Sikorski, is now saying that Europe is indeed in a kind of a war with the Russians. The European states, even as they have armed Ukraine, even as they have seized, or at least frozen, Russian assets, and now explore ways to seize them, even as they have aided and abetted sabotage operations and other things by Ukraine deep inside Russia, even as they have supplied weapons to Ukraine like Storm Shadows and Scout missiles, and have provided the technical guidance and support to enable Ukraine to conduct strikes within pre-2014 Russian territory. Even as they have been doing all of those things, even as they've been floating ideas of seizing ships that conduct trade with Russia, that carry cargoes, oil principally, from Russia on the high seas, even as they plan all of these things. Anyway, they have always consistently insisted that they are not at war with Russia. They have hidden behind that. They tell their people that despite all the rhetoric, despite the anger, they're not actually at war with Russia. And on that basis, they classify any action that the Russians take or threaten to take or might conceivably take that might counter any of these moves, confiscating assets, launching missiles into Russia, doing any of these things, that they classify any action that the Russians would take as aggression by Russia against themselves. Because you see, they are, despite all of the things that they are doing, they're actually in some kind of peace with Russia. This has been an absurd claim, but it is one that all European governments have hidden behind and insisted upon. Now we have no less a person than the Foreign Minister of Poland, Radek Sikorski, coming out and saying that Europe is indeed in a kind of war with Russia. He admits that this is a strange war, that armies, European armies and Russian armies, are not openly clashing and fighting each other, but he nonetheless says that though this is a strange war, an undeclared war, because there's been no declarations of war, it is not a war, of course, authorized by any resolution of the UN Security Council or anything like that. Nonetheless, it is a kind of war nonetheless. And other European officials have now taken to parroting this comment of the Polish Foreign Minister, as I say, of Sikorski's. They are all now, or at least some of them, are now saying that despite the fact that Europe is not at war, it actually is at war. It is now at war, apparently, with the Russians. And, of course, the proof of this, the evidence that Europe is indeed at war with the Russians, is all of the various things that I've discussed in several programs now. The drones, the Russian drones, which entered Polish airspace, which the Europeans, despite deploying all the sophisticated weapons in their arsenal, F-35s, and all that, were largely unable to shoot down. the MiG-31s that travelled from one Russian base in Karelia to another Russian base in Kaliningrad, along the actually rather narrow air route that they're allowed to travel. And as I've said, it's possible that they might have skirted it and flown over this uninhabited rock on the Baltic Sea, which is part of Estonian territory. Anyway, all these events, which, as I have discussed in many programs, amount in themselves, each one by themselves, to practically nothing, and which are things which have happened before and happened many times. Anyway, all of these things taken together are supposedly proof that Europe and Russia are in some sort of state of war. And, well, not to be left behind, Ursula von der Leyen, according to Politico, is now looking to change the character of the European Union. She is now apparently proposing or discussing fundamental changes to the entire structure of the European Union to make it into an overt military alliance. This at one and the same time as European officials, according to the Financial Times, are telling the Ukrainians to accelerate steps towards joining the European Union, technical steps within Ukraine to join the European Union, despite objections from Hungary and Slovakia, and I strongly suspect various other European countries. All of this is completely extraordinary, and frankly, it is not just unwise and reckless, but it is also dangerous, of course, but it is also deeply counterproductive. In terms of the escalation of rhetoric, the talk about Europe being in a state of war with Russia, I can't help but think that this is partly in order to justify the Ursula Merz plan to use the frozen Russian assets as some kind of security for the big loan that the Europeans are trying to put together to support Ukraine. The 140 billion euro loan, this is to be made up from contributions provided by European states, which will, of course, also be floated as bonds by those European states. So we're going to look at a pooling of borrowing by the European states, Eurobonds in other words, something which, of course, the Germans have always objected to, or at least have objected to in the past. 140 billion in loans, but it's all supposed to be repaid eventually from the Russian frozen assets as some kind of reparation payment. Of course, the Russians will never agree to pay reparations, and it's likely that they're going to win the war. And confiscation of assets, outright confiscation of assets of foreign governments, is something that historically and legally can only take place in wartime. In fact, there was a powerful article in the Financial Times about a year ago which counselled against confiscating the Russian assets precisely because, as it said, it would blur the boundary between war and peace. Well, it seems to me that what Sikorsky and others are trying to do is that they understand that the Russians will never repay the reparations. So that the only way ultimately to get legally or semi-legally or pseudo-legally their hands on these assets, what's left of them, because I don't believe that they're all there anymore, is by going the full way and saying that, well, we might not be actually at war with the Russians. I mean, not in the classical sense, but we are actually in a kind of war with the Russians. And because we're in a kind of war with the Russians, that means that we are actually able to seize their assets. I think this is probably part of what this is all about. But of course it does have implications, because I doubt that this kind of argument is going to stand much prospect of success in international courts. And it's important to say that though courts within the European Union and in the West probably will follow the line taken by Western governments in relation to this matter, there are other courts outside Western jurisdictions which nonetheless do have enforcement powers against Western assets located in other places in the world, especially in Asia, which are much more likely to take a much more conventional, if you prefer, orthodox legal view of this. But anyway, it's an argument, and I expect that this is one of the arguments that is going to be made, because the reality is that you can dress it up as a loan, you can pretend that it is a loan, you can say that it's the European taxpayers who are on the hook for it, but ultimately the plan clearly is to use the Russian assets to supposedly pay this loan. And in fact, and in reality, I can't imagine that if a loan like this is indeed floated, the assets would not be seized very soon after. Anyway, that's one of the reasons why this is dangerous, because there's going to be legal repercussions. And as Thomas Fazi has written in another fine article that he has written on his Substack blog, and which I believe you can also find on Unheard, and as Wolfgang Monschau has also written in another fine article that he has written also on Unheard, but which I believe you can also find on the Euro Intelligence website. This is an incredibly bad idea. Anyway, putting aside the legal ramifications, because what it means, as the Prime Minister of Belgium has been trying to remind everybody, is that from this point onwards, nobody in the global south, outside the collective West, is going to trust European financial institutions as a safe place to hold their money. And inevitably, it is going to drain away the credibility of the European financial system. Both Wolfgang Monschau and especially Thomas Fazi have made the further point that the decline in the euro's position as a reserve currency, it is fading. It is no longer increasing. It is increasingly being avoided by third country players in that role. And the problems that the dollar is experiencing in this respect also are undoubtedly, in part at least, a reflection of the damage done to the credibility of Western financial institutions by the original decision made back in February 2022 to freeze the Russian reserves. By the way, it's just worth pointing out here that the original intention in freezing those Russian reserves was to deprive the Russian central bank of use of them in supporting the ruble. And the assumption then was, and I remember reading a long explanation of all of this on the White House website, provided for us courtesy of an anonymous Biden administration official whose identity has never been disclosed. Anyway, the theory behind this was that all of the other steps that the Western powers were taking at that time would cause a massive run on the ruble, the disconnections from SWIFT, the various other sanctions, the attack on imports of Russian oil and gas, the suspension of gas transfers via Nord Stream 2, all of that would create a massive run on the ruble and denied access to half its central bank reserves. The Russian central bank would be unable to support the ruble. And I remember reading, again, in that same article, in the Biden White House website, that this was going to lead, that same US administration official say that this would lead the ruble itself to collapse. There would be a catastrophic plunge in its value. And President Biden, a few days later, on a trip to Poland, actually spoke about the ruble having been reduced to rubble, clearly assuming that this plan had succeeded. That was the original idea behind the freezing of the reserves. And the assumption, I suspect, at that time was that this would only be a temporary freeze because there would be a collapse of the Putin government as a result of this financial collapse in Russia, and then a new pro-Western government would be installed, and the negotiations would take place, and the central bank reserves would then be used, presumably to pay compensation to Ukraine and to other Western countries as the Europeans and the Americans at that time were dictating. Well, of course, it has turned out completely otherwise. The ruble, for the record, is currently trading at roughly the same level that it was in February 2022. Just saying, it has certainly not turned into rubble or anything like that. And instead, we're now talking about outright confiscation of the Russian reserves, which, as I said, was never, I believe, the original plan, in order to give them to Zelensky. A bad idea at every conceivable level. But to be clear again, the fact that in the West they're talking about this at all is itself a sign of their total failure. Anyway, that is already, as I said, a very bad plan. But let's now turn to the other side of this, which is Ursula's proposal that the European Union be reorganized and that it become an outright military defense alliance and all of that. And this is now apparently all been worked out. Well, as I've discussed in many programs, the only person, as far as I can see, left in Russia who still believes that it is a good idea for Ukraine to join the EU one day is none other than President Putin. I don't know whether he actually thinks that this is a good plan, but he repeatedly says, he continuously says that every country has the right to decide its trade and business plans by itself. Russia has never interfered with that. And since the European Union is a trade and commercial entity, not an alliance, whether Ukraine joins the European Union or not is none of Russia's business. Hardly anybody else in Russia agrees with Putin about this anymore. Both Medvedev and Lavrov have published statements which make it perfectly clear that they do not. And in one of his recent exchanges with the media, Putin was on the receiving end. A rather aggressive questioning by his own favorite journalist, Pavel Zarubin, basically telling Putin, what are you talking about? Are you familiar with what the EU is becoming? It cannot be simply classified as a trade and business partnership organization anymore. Well, if Ursula's plans are pushed forward, if they are translated into fact, then it isn't going to be impossible for Putin to continue to cling to this fiction, because it is a fiction. So the European Union is simply a trade and commercial pact. And at that point, and we're probably talking about a decision that's going to be made very soon, especially if Ursula makes her ideas public, which I expect she will. At some point, the Russians are going to come out straightforwardly and will say that given the way in which the European Union is changing, it is no longer acceptable for Ukraine to join the European Union. And not just Ukraine, but I would not be surprised if they say the same about Moldova as well, and perhaps about other countries in the former Soviet space, like Georgia and Armenia also. Just saying. Anyway, in which case, there will be a new point of conflict, a new issue of conflict between Russia and the West. I believe this is coming. I believe this is an inexorable process now. It's one of those crashes you can see from a distance. When it comes to Ursula, as far as I can see, she's one of those drivers who, when she sees an obstacle ahead of her, her immediate instinct is to push down harder on the accelerator. So that, I think, is coming, and it is only a question of time. Meanwhile, even as the Europeans talk in this way, obviously the plans, the ideas about sending missiles, more weapons to Ukraine continue to be floating around. Now, the Ukrainians, Zelensky says that Ukraine has received 2 new Patriot missile systems from Israel, or at least 1 Patriot missile system. Apparently another is on its way. And the German government, the German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius, says that Germany intends to supply Ukraine with 2 more Patriot missile systems before the end of the year. 4, in other words, in total. I mean, the problem is not that there is a shortage of Patriot missile systems, if we mean by that radars and launchers. No doubt there's plenty of those. The problem is that there is a general shortage of Patriot missile interceptors, of the missiles themselves. What I know about the Israeli Patriots that Ukraine is receiving is that they are older versions, and perhaps there are more missiles for this older version around than they are of the newer version, which is the one that has been supplied to Ukraine up to now. So there may be more missiles for the Israeli supplied launchers. But since we're talking about older missiles, which are not apparently tasked or designed to shoot down ballistic missiles, by definition, these Patriot missile systems are going to be less effective than the ones that Ukraine has received in the past, though it is debatable how effective even those have been. The German systems are going to leave Germany without Patriot missile systems overall, or so I understand. Europe, already critically short of air defense systems, is stripping itself of those few remaining systems that it still has. This was all based on the assumption that the United States was going to make up the difference, that it was going to supply new systems to replace the old ones that were being sent to Ukraine. But the latest word from the United States is that the United States is prioritizing its own needs in terms of missile interceptors, which means that the Europeans will probably not be receiving any additional Patriot systems and interceptors from the United States. Well, I've heard it suggested for at least 3 years. Here we have the Europeans talking about how they are in effect at war with Russia, and they are disarming themselves. We hear an awful lot about the enormous military build-up in Europe that is taking place. There is no overt sign of it so far. The reality is that far from building up weapons and building up armed forces, the European militaries are continuing to grow weaker and weaker because everything that there is still to spare is being shipped off to the black hole, the whirlpool into which everything sinks and ultimately disappears, which is Ukraine. We could see again here the extraordinary divergence between rhetoric and reality in Europe. Boris Pistorius, the German defense minister, by the way, has said that the idea of creating a drone wall to stop the Russians is unrealistic. He is absolutely right about that, by the way. In truth, it is a fantasy. And I've been reading in many places about how President Zelensky is apparently wanting to complete a $90 billion arms package with the United States, one which would presumably be paid for by European money. Well, in fact, that looks to me like a fantasy also, except notice that the Europeans are talking about a 140 billion euro loan to Ukraine. Could it be that where most of that money will go, the 140 billion will go, will be by $90 billion of weapons from the United States, which would, of course, in many cases take years or even decades to arrive. But you could see how all of that money in the meantime will end up in the US MIC, the military industrial complex. I have to say, that is very, very much how it all looks to me. Could it be, in fact, that what this loan, this 140 billion euro loan is really about, is not about helping Ukraine at all, but about paying for American weapons? And, in other words, finding some means to continue to transfer funds, only they would be seized Russian funds to the United States. Just saying. Anyway, let's move on and let's go back to the topic of the Tomahawk missiles, because here again, I wonder whether the real plan is to actually send Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, whether, as it is with the loan that the Europeans are now talking about, that they're buying weapons which ultimately will remain mostly in Europe, but which will be bought from the United States. And the same is with the Tomahawks, because we know that the Germans are already talking about buying the Typhoon system from the United States. And I believe that the first Typhoon system with the Tomahawks is supposed to reach Germany next year. And it could be that the Germans, Friedrich Merz and company, are planning ultimately to finance at least some of Germany's arms buildup with weapons bought from the United States with Russian money. As I said, all on the basis that Europe is in a kind of war with Russia. Well, after my program yesterday, I have received a lot of feedback about Tomahawk missiles, especially from one source, but also from various other people as well. And these people, these sources, have a much better understanding of Tomahawk missiles than I do. And the complete overwhelming consensus is that this is an incredibly bad idea, and that it would be a bad idea from the United States, and that it would not succeed, it would not assist Ukraine. Now, one point that I had not appreciated is that though the Tomahawk actually has a big warhead, because of the way in which the warhead is designed, and because of certain properties of the missile itself, it does not, the missile does not provide a great deal of kinetic force when it impacts on a target. The missile is basically designed to strike relatively soft targets, lighter bunkers, and that kind of thing. It is not really designed to strike at heavily fortified positions. And I've been told that if it is to be used effectively against more hardened positions, it has to be launched in large numbers to strike at those positions. Against, say, hardened positions, you'd need 5 Tomahawk missiles launched against 1 to do real damage. And, well, putting aside the fact that the United States has only a relatively limited inventory of these missiles, apparently 4,000 in total, perhaps it could access 10,000, including its own arsenal and from its allies and around the world, and that might be a challenge. But, 5 missiles in total per one target per strike, you would need against a country like Russia, if you were going to stick with conventional warheads, to launch very large numbers of these missiles, and given Russia's size, that would mean that you deplete your arsenal again fast. If you could launch missiles in those kind of numbers, which of course, if we're talking about ground-launched missiles, which is the only missiles that Ukraine could be provided with, because it's not going to receive strategic bombers or Aegis-class destroyers or anything of that kind. If we're talking about ground-launched missiles, it cannot be done because the Typhoon system doesn't exist in large quantities. It is only now entering service. It is expensive and takes a long time to build, and it can only launch a small amount of missiles in any one go. And that isn't even taking into account the Russian air defenses. Now, some people are very skeptical about the Tomahawk system's ability as against Russian air defenses. It's not just subsonic, but not very fast subsonic either. It's been suggested that it is a generation behind Russian subsonic missiles, cruise missiles, like the KH-101 and the Calibre. I am not going to explore that. I have no reason to doubt that these claims are true. And as I've said many times, the Russians have the technology, undoubtedly, to shoot down Tomahawk missiles, and they've been working on this since at least the 1970s. I would add that as a result of Tomahawk missile strikes that took place in Syria in 2017 and I believe 2018, the Russians were provided by the Syrians with virtually complete examples of Tomahawk missiles. So they will have examined and no doubt understood the technology quite well. Perhaps since those missile strikes, the Tomahawks have been updated in some ways, though I'm not aware that they have been, but perhaps they have been. But anyway, regardless of that, I doubt that they've been upgraded to the extent that Russian familiarity with this missile has been completely cancelled out. So anyway, this is a bad idea. It cannot work. The missile is simply not appropriate for use by Ukraine. Talk of using the Tomahawk missile in this way makes no sense, and as various people are pointing out, because it is ultimately a strategic system designed around nuclear warheads, using it in this fashion against a nuclear power like Russia is inevitably and automatically going to massively lower the nuclear use thresholds as the Russians move towards high warning mode in the event that these kind of missiles are launched against them. So again, we see fantastic ideas being proposed, but I wonder whether ultimately any of this is truly intended to help Ukraine. Whether the $90 billion arms package is really intended for Ukraine. Whether the Patriot missiles that the Western powers are going to buy from the United States for Ukraine are really intended for Ukraine in the end. Whether the Tomahawk missiles are really for German use, not for Ukrainian use at all. Whether all of this talk about war, Europe being in a state of war, about confiscating Russian assets, isn't another way to try to accelerate European rearmament, but not in order to help Ukraine, but ultimately, purportedly, in order to build up European defenses with American weapons purchases based on confiscated Russian money, but weapons purchases from the United States, which are not, in the end, going to help Europe very much, because the weapons that we're talking about, the Patriot missiles, the Tomahawks, are ultimately old technology weapons that are now being superseded by other ones, but which will be another shot in the arm for the US military-industrial complex, in other words, for the US MIC. So all of this hysteria, all of this paranoia, all of those extraordinary words from people like Radek Sikorski, is this ultimately, in the end, what this is all about? Convert the European Union into a military alliance, seize the Russian assets, buy these weapons from the United States. They're not going to make Europe more secure. They're not going to change the military balance in Europe at all. But they will provide a further income stream for the military-industrial complex in the United States. They will keep Donald Trump happy. They will keep the Americans committed to Europe in some form, and they will keep people like Ursula and Mark Rutte and the others in their jobs. I know this sounds cynical. My friend Alex Christoforou, my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, has recently published what I think is a very insightful post on X, in which he said that at this point in the Ukraine conflict, the priority for the Europeans increasingly is not winning the war in Ukraine, which deep down they all know is lost, but keeping the money flow, the grift going. And I have to say, that is how it looks like to me. Anyway, let's now turn to the situation on the battlefronts in Ukraine, because obviously this is what we ultimately have to talk about. Now, Denis Pushilin, what this whole issue is all about. Now, Denis Pushilin, who is the head of the Russian government, if you wish, in Donetsk, he's now provided an update about what he says is the situation in the Pokrovsk area. And this is what he said. In the Pokrovsk area, we see our units advancing in several key directions. We are expanding the area under our control in the Dobropolye Bulge. Now, this is the area northeast of Pokrovsk, where the Russians achieved their breakthrough in August. But then Pushilin went on to say, the enemy, he means the Ukrainians, have claimed in the information space that it has erased and removed the Dobropolye Bulge several times over. This is not true. We are holding our positions and expanding the area under our control. So this is an official claim from a Russian official. It's a clear claim which has been made on Russian television by Pushilin, who is a Russian official and who presumably does know the situation in this area. And it seems to be intended to contradict contrary claims made by Syrskyi, the chief of staff of the Ukrainian armed forces, that the Ukrainians have the initiative in this same area and that they have taken the Russians in this area of this breakthrough into a cauldron. As several people are pointing out, the accounts of what's going on in this area of the breakthrough provided by the Russians and the Ukrainians are diametrically opposite. Someone is clearly lying. And to be frank, based on all of the information I have seen, the video footage and all of that, I believe it is the Ukrainians. Zelensky and Syrskyi have recently been telling Kellogg and the Americans that they are winning the war. And in order to persuade them that they are winning the war, they've had to make up all of these stories of Ukrainian victories. I would not be at all surprised if one of the things that has caused President Trump and others in the United States, General Kellogg, to come up with all of those claims about the Ukrainians winning the war is false information provided by Zelensky and Syrskyi, that in the area of the Russian breakthrough northeast of Pakrovsk, the Ukrainians are winning and that they have thousands of Russian troops encircled. I don't believe that that is the case at all. I think if the Americans have been deceived in this way, they're going to find that out fairly quickly. And I believe that when they do, well, we might very well see another pendulum shift, with some people in the United States very angry with Zelensky and Syrskyi for what the false information that they are giving, and perhaps angry with people like General Kellogg for conveying that information to American senior officials and American television audiences. Just saying. Anyway, according to Radovka, the Russians absolutely have the whole situation in this area under control. They have recaptured or are in the process of recapturing the important village of Nikoronovka, which the Ukrainians briefly recaptured. They're pushing back towards Vladimirovka, which is also a village that the Ukrainians captured in this area. And they're continuing to advance. And in fact, it is the Russians, not the Ukrainians, who are gradually encircling the Ukrainian troops in the area of the village of Shakhovo and elsewhere in this area northeast of Pakrovsk. Anyway, that's my view. Now, Radovka has also provided more information about the state of the battle in Pakrovsk itself. It published a map. The map seems to show something like 2/3 of Pakrovsk, including most of central Pakrovsk, under Russian control. It spoke about the Ukrainian troops in southeastern Pakrovsk being effectively cut off from resupply. Well, we've been hearing that for a while. And also the Russians having broken into many of the big areas of the high-rise buildings in southeastern Pakrovsk as well. And there are also reports that the Russians are also pushing into this same area from the east, that there's now fighting going on in Mirnograd and other places. There's been many reports at various stages of this battle of the Russians having broken into Mirnograd, but it looks like it might be true this time. Anyway, that the point is that the Ukrainian forces in Pakrovsk are encircled, according to the Russians, and that the circle is shrinking, and that the Russians now control the greater part of Pokrovsk. I, of course, have no independent information to corroborate any one of these claims, but as I have repeatedly pointed out, the information that Redovka has given about this battle has repeatedly turned out to be true. Everywhere else, the Russians continue to advance. They appear now to control fully all of the villages to the north and east of Liman, in the northern areas of the battlefield near Slavyansk. There seem to be no barriers now before the Russians, before they attack Liman itself, and I expect the first Russian attack on Liman to start within the next couple of days. Reports have now appeared that the Russians have now captured a large belt of territory north of Siversk, close to the village of Dronivka. The Russians supposedly control around a third to a half of the larger village of Yampol to the west. It looks as if Dronivka and Yampol are soon going to fall, in which case the supply lines to Ukraine from the west, to Siversk rather, from the west, are cut off, and the defense of Siversk becomes untenable. There's also adjustments. Deep State, the Ukrainian mapping project, has done adjustments to its map of Kupiansk, which seem to confirm the Russian General Staff's claims that the Russians control most of the territory to the west of Kupiansk, so that Kupiansk is largely in a cauldron. The Ukrainian troops that are still holding out in limited areas of Kupiansk, west of the Oskol River. Their only means of escape now appears to be by crossing the Oskol River, and going to the industrial sector of Kupiansk, which is located on the east bank of the Oskol River. I doubt, by the way, that this is a tenable position to hold for much longer either. If the Russians capture all of the territory of Kupiansk west of the Oskol River, they will be on high ground. The west bank is higher than the east bank. The Russians already have the Ukrainians on the east bank of the Oskol River in the industrial area, essentially surrounded, and this territory is anyway quite small, and I suspect that they would, if western Kupiansk falls completely under Russian control, the Ukrainians will have to retreat from it, retreat from eastern Kupiansk. They'll have to escape from the east bank, the area of Kupiansk on the east bank, very fast as well. One way or the other, this battle has gone on too long from a Ukrainian point of view. Too many men and machines have been sacrificed holding on to this town. But I suspect that even the Ukrainians understand that this can't go on for much longer. And in Zaporozhye region, the Russian advance continues, and it appears to be continuing relentlessly, and there have been more reports of further Russian advances over the course of the last 24 hours, which I'm going to discuss in later programs. So, Europeans talk about a war, that they are at war. Perhaps they're talking about it, as I said, for all of the reasons that I've said, to confiscate the Russian assets, to use those assets to buy weapons, purportedly for Ukraine, but which they intend to use ultimately for themselves. But the key thing to understand is that the real war, the one that is being fought in Ukraine, is being lost, and whatever it is that the Europeans think that they are achieving by what they're doing offers bleak prospects ultimately for the people of Europe. But anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.